From the bombed-out ruins of their community club, the survivors of one of the most horrifying acts in this war sing in lusty defiance. The villagers of Yahidne are about to be the star witnesses in Ukraine's biggest war crimes trial to date. They fall silent. They're honouring those who didn't make it through the largest single kidnapping carried out by Russian troops during their invasion of the country. The memories of what they've all been through are still searingly raw. In the basement of the village school, Russian soldiers held hostage almost the entire community. Ivan was amongst nearly 400 villagers held captive underground here for nearly a month. The picture taken on their release shows one of the bigger cells, packed full of hostages. They were crammed in like this all the time, starved, terrified and tortured. 368 villagers in all, 69 of them children. The hostages were even crammed down the corridor, there were so many. Everyone was sitting right up against each other, Ivan says. They wrote there were 55. The few photos taken when they were found show how crushed they were. They spoke of being in the same position for 16 hours a stretch. They were split up amongst a network of different sized cells with no hygiene, little air and just buckets to go to the toilet in, with all the rooms horribly overcrowded. They put numbers on the outside of the room. There were 19 in here. And look at the size of this cell. No windows. And out of the 19, 9 of them were children. There was no room to lie down or sleep properly. No war, the words say. The children drew themselves with unhappy faces amongst hopeful hearts and Ukrainian flags. Ivan, who was the school caretaker, shows us how they scribbled the national anthem on the wall, defiant in the face of such terror. And there are other pictures showing executions they feared or witnessed. Few thought they'd get out alive.
It was really scary for the children and grandchildren. It was like a nightmare. I don't know how we got through it.
Yahidne is in the northern Chernihiv region near the Belarus border and was stormed by Russian troops 7 days after the invasion began. The soldiers set up camp inside the village's only school, turning it into their headquarters. The big sandy scars on the school grounds are where they dug in their military vehicles around the perimeter. Schools, like hospitals, are protected under international law, and hiding inside to launch attacks is considered a war crime. Holding civilians captive inside a school and using them as human shields is also against global rules of warfare. And the Ukrainians say this is exactly what the Russian soldiers did during the 28 days of hell in the school basement. As the villagers were kept below ground, satellite images show us what was happening above. This image, taken before the Russians entered Yahidne, shows the school to the left of the picture, with thick forest on its southwest side, which gave cover to the invading soldiers. A week into their occupation, a large number of military vehicles can be seen by the school, hidden beneath the trees. They're also parked between houses in the village, and you can see people in the schoolyard. By the 3rd week of the Russians being in Yahidne, the pictures show the army units still positioned around the school. Surrounding buildings have been destroyed, and the school's roof has been damaged. On the school's top floors, with the Russian troops bedded in, the fighting was non-stop. There's a lot of damage here, with holes punched out. Obviously, evidence of rockets coming through. The Ukrainian forces trying to push the Russians out knew they were holding hostages underneath, and the captives being held underground could only listen helplessly to the fierce battles going on above them.
The Russians wanted to use us as protection, because they thought our soldiers wouldn't shell us, so they were hoping they'd be safe. But we wanted them to shell us to kick the Russians out.
And when the Russians were forced to retreat a month later, they left behind a mass of evidence. We've been given rare access to what the Ukrainian prosecutors found: whole military files, a soldier's backpack, phones and SIM cards, as well as commander's orders. They've identified 15 Russian soldiers that they believe violated the international rules of war when they were involved in the battle around Yahidne school.
We're trying to prove that this large number of people, more than 360, were kept in the basement of a school and used by the Russian troops as human shields against the Ukrainian forces.
And they're confident they have the physical evidence left behind by the soldiers. There are also hundreds of witnesses to what happened inside the basement who'll testify about the brutal conditions they were held in, which led to the deaths of at least 10 of the hostages. The survivors held captive together are staunchly patriotic, and several told us how their elderly neighbours and friends died, starving and weak, with the Russian guards just leaving the corpses amongst them.
Whenever someone died, we covered their face, just so we didn't have to look at them. But sometimes they lay there, next to us, for 24 hours.
Some of the children kept underground in the dark amongst the corpses were babies or toddlers. Others, like Marina and Lilia, were young teenagers when they were held captive.
We went down there as children and we left as adults with a very different view about everything. All our values changed. You start to appreciate being healthy, being able to sleep in your own warm bed, not feeling hot but having fresh air and being free.
I try to tell everyone that everything will be okay. We will get out. But the others were saying they'll throw a grenade down here, they'll shoot us, they'll do something. I believed they wouldn't, but when there's so much stress, you stop trusting yourself.
They weren't even safe when they were allowed out to bury their dead. The village priest, who was amongst those being held, was given permission to leave the basement to help dig the graves and say the funeral prayers. And he says even then the Russians attacked them.
We dug the graves, but during the burial we were shelled. It was, I remember the first 5 or 7 strikes, and then I got concussion and hurt my shoulder and my back, and other guys were also injured.
Ukrainian forensic investigators showed us the new technological devices which they're hoping will seal a guilty verdict in the courts. They've taken thousands of images, using for the first time in the country a range of 3D scanners to document what happened inside. It's an incredible technological weapon which freezes the crime scene forever, so forensic analysts, lawyers and police can minutely examine and zoom in on every part of the investigation site.
The whole village was a hostage.
The investigators worked with a team from the International Criminal Court, and with the DNA collected and the 3D imagery, it's all expected to be used in a future prosecution at The Hague.
We have information that people killed there, and they will just put into the wood and the forest, and nobody knows where these people are.
If convicted, those responsible will be put on a global list of war criminals, and the Ukrainian teams are hoping for early results.
I want to hear the first verdicts this year. That's what I want, and it's the wish of millions of Ukrainians too. But not just a verdict, also punishment. We want the people guilty of these crimes and murders and the damage done to our country to take responsibility for their actions by the end of the year.
In Yahidne, the whole village community is still trying to get over a collective trauma, waiting for their day in court to tell how a Russian commander attempted to bribe the starving villagers with baby food and nappies if they agreed to give false interviews.
He said, we need you to find someone who will be interviewed on Russian television to say that we've saved you and protected you from the Ukrainians. And he said he wanted another interview, calling on our president to resign to stop the war.
With hardly any light in the basement, the hostages struggled to work out day from night. And one of the school teachers smuggled in a chunk of charcoal to keep a note of the days and the dead.
I think they didn't want us to feel like humans. For the first 10 days, there was no hygiene at all. We couldn't even wash our hands.
Some of the residents were killed as the Russians entered the village. Mikhailo's son Victor was one of the first shot, execution style.
17 days he was lying in his yard. 17 days. He was barefoot and his hands were tied behind his back.
A key part of the prosecution case will rest on the Russians setting up military positions in the middle of the tiny village and hiding amongst their homes. The villagers have already been a little bolstered by the guilty verdicts handed out to soldiers involved in terrorizing Nadia Radchenko's family. Her husband was killed, her house looted and guns put to their heads. And Ukrainian lawmakers sentenced 3 Russian soldiers to 12 years in prison in absentia.
It's good to get a verdict, but not good they're still walking free, because everyone needs to be held accountable. And if you deliberately came to attack us, you need to be punished.
There's much unresolved anguish over just what happened here and the torment they endured in the small village of Yahidne, the community which stood in the way of the Russian troops and their plans to besiege the capital. And there's a lot of hope being pinned on the upcoming war crimes trial to avenge everything they went through and those who perished. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Yahidne in northern Ukraine.